So as many of you know, the essence of this event, particularly tomorrow evening, is the continued celebration of the 5th anniversary of the Space Force. We focused on the Space Force in our This Day in Air and Space Force History releases. You've seen a lot of rockets and missiles and astronauts and scientists and stuff every morning, as much as we can. And a lot of that has to do with Stu with his foot on my throat to do that, which has been great. We focused on the Space Force in the December Journal and carried it through to the special summer edition that you have. Great kudos go out to Richard Wolf, who is our editor for that. He listens to crazy ideas from stupid executive directors and makes them into a really cool product and a great commemoration for this particular event, which I think it's really nice to have the programs in the front because it kind of preserves what is going on, what we're trying to do with both the Sympo and the event. And then to have the event in the space hangar, wow, that's all I can say. It's going to be fabulous, just fabulous. So we still have a couple of holes. If you decide you want to come tomorrow night, come and talk to me and we'll leg wrestle for a seat, okay? I'm going to turn it over to our space vice chair, Stu Pettis, and he's going to lead the discussion with General D.T. Thompson. Thank you, sir, for being here. I'll let you do the introductions as you want to do them, but this begins really the celebration of happy 5th anniversary Space Force. So go get them.
Okay, so folks, as Dick mentioned, I'm Stuart Pettis. One of the things I've been doing with this Historical Foundation this year is really trying to focus on the history of the Space Force. And so we've done, amongst other things, a series of podcasts, and I tried to focus on stories that probably didn't get captured. I lived part of the history, and I can tell you we didn't do a great job capturing some of the history, so we did a podcast. We had Jack Fisher, who actually surprised me by being here today, who led something called Task Force Tango, which was a planning group in Colorado Springs that basically led to Space Operations Command. We have upcoming podcasts as well with Stephen Katay, who was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. And we also have another one with General Troy Endicott, who was at the National Security Council during the whole lead up to the Space Force. But I will tell you the panel I've been really looking forward to is this one. Anyone fans of the musical Hamilton? Anybody? I will admit, okay. General Thompson was in the room where it happened. So a lot of this history, he helped shape, he helped influence, and he helped make happen. So I'm just incredibly excited to do this. If you don't know General Thompson, you saw his picture and his bio up there. 38 years in the Air Force and the Space Force. He's an actual Guardian, retired from the Space Force. Culminated as the very first Vice Chief of Space Operations. But in December 2019, sir, you were the Vice Commander of Air Force Space Command, but you were forward deployed to the Pentagon. We'll get into that story a little bit because that's interesting, and this should be a fun panel. So, sir, right off the bat, one of the questions we often get is this: we've been talking about a Space Force for quite a while, or Space Corps. In 2001, there was a Space Commission that also known as the Rumsfeld Commission, and so 2001 we thought that might happen. But you were there; you lived a lot of this history. What was different in 2019?
Well, Stu, you're exactly right. But first, let me say thanks to you for calling and asking me to be part of this, and to the Air Force Historical Foundation for what you're doing in this regard. It is important history to capture, and I'm not sure anybody is actively or prepared to do the kind of job that you all are doing to capture it. So thanks for that. But Stu, you're exactly right. In this commission, led by Donald Rumsfeld before he was nominated to be Secretary of Defense the second time, finished its work and published its report on January 11th of 2001, talking about a look at the organization and management of national security space, primarily inside the Department of Defense, but really inside the administration. And the kinds of things that you saw out of that commission weren't surprising, and certainly ahead of their time, or perhaps at the time. insisting on, we were still committed to the peaceful use of space, but it was time to start thinking much more seriously about a couple other things. A rewrite and a revamp of national space policy, the need to look at policies, activities, and capabilities that would deter hostile acts in space and defend against them. And then the statement that it was time to take a serious look at the organization, not just, the fact that you had the Air Force, but you had the National Reconnaissance Office and others. That was January 11th, 2001. As you know, September of that year, other things happened, and rightly so. The nation's priorities and focus shifted for a couple of decades as we dealt with the terrorist threat. So that went very quickly on the back burner. And I'm not sure, certainly in that time and era, there would have been more conversation. There was a lot of conversation among space folks, national security space folks inside the Air Force and others about the potential for this to lead somewhere. But obviously, once September 11th happened, we all understood pretty clearly that this was not the time, and that was probably, it might have been good that this wasn't the time. You could have that conversation forever, but in the intervening years, in 2007, the really big wake-up call occurred inside the space community when China demonstrated through a weapon system test its ability to destroy satellites on orbit, as it did with one of its obsolete weather satellites. And that conversation really energized, I'll call it almost Billy Mitchell style conversation inside the Air Force. Several folks like General Bob Kaler, General Kevin Chilton, General Willie Shelton were very much advocates in beating the drum for the concern about the threats that we faced in space. Not that many people were listening intently for a couple of reasons. One, we were still a little bit busy with the global war on terror. But the second was a lot of that conversation occurred in classified channels because we wouldn't discuss openly exactly what had happened and why, and the vulnerabilities, the threats and vulnerabilities we faced because of that. But that drumbeat continued, and by late in 2014, as that conversation continued, as we saw, especially China, take more and more aggressive action, it really did get to the point where national leadership in the Department of Defense, national leadership in the White House, national leadership in Congress were increasingly talking openly and publicly about the fact that space was too important, and we had far too many threats and vulnerabilities that we had to deal with. So by then, and it was especially, Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense at the time, did work in that regard, but especially the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, then was one of those leading advocates to say we have to get our hands on that. And that really did roll into the first Trump administration. And by that time, in Congress, especially in Congress, there was so much vocal support for the need to change the way the space has happened that in that intervening period, it really led up to 2019. A true recognition in Congress, in the White House, on both sides of the political aisles, that we were far too dependent on space, and there were too many risks and vulnerabilities to let things continue the way they had been continuing for decades.
So 2019, or I think prior to that, you came to the Pentagon.
I did.
To lead something called A11.
Yeah. Yep.
And that never shows up on an org chart anywhere. Can you tell that story?
Okay, so I talked about 2014. By the fall of 2020, the debate and the activity was just going on full bore. In fact, inside of the Air Force, the Department of the Air Force, certainly many people, but it was led by the Secretary at the time. Secretary Wilson, I think, was on board by then in the fall of 2016. General Goldfein, General Raymond was the commander of Air Force Base Command. And their staffs, myself and others included, were very much deeply engaged in how should we change the organizational structure and better advocate and support for space capabilities inside the United States Air Force. And that started in earnest in the fall of 2016. And in fact, through that period, I was the one who was they pointed to say, figure this out and go make it happen. So I did, and through the fall of 2016 and early 2017, we did all that work. And just as after, I don't know if Dave Deptula is still here, but he talked about the problem the Air Force had flying nuclear weapons around the country, 2007-ish. It led to the creation of the Deputy Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force for nuclear operations, in essence. I don't remember the exact name, but the A-10 in the Napoleonic structure was focused on strategic deterrence and nuclear activities. So what we decided was that was the model inside the Air Force to follow. So we developed a plan and the model for the Deputy Chief of Staff for space operations. Deputy Chief of Staff on the Air Staff reporting to the Chief, led by a 3-star, and it was according to the Napoleonic Code, A11, although I'm pretty sure Napoleon never had an 11 on his staff, but it was the A11. And in fact, had gone through this development, had built the plan, and for the National Space Symposium. National Space Symposium happens every year, March, April, out in Colorado Springs. Huge deal now in the space community. We had planned this huge rollout for the way the Air Force was going to totally reform the way it was going to do space for Thursday of that week in Colorado Springs. General Goldfein was there. It was actually, I think, Lisa Disbrow, the under, who was going to be there with him. Big rollout, big press conference. It was going to be awesome. Well, it turns out Tuesday morning at a breakfast, 2 days before that rollout, Congressman Mike Rogers, House Armed Services Committee from Alabama, gave a speech. He invited the world, including General Raymond, who was sitting in the front row, but the press and everybody else, and just excoriated the Air Force on a whole host of ways, a whole host of examples of how the Air Force was simply not doing right by space. And of course, that made huge news. And one of his key points was he showed this spaghetti chart of the organization of space inside the Department of Defense and said basically 60 boxes. There are 60 organizations you have to deal with. You're trying to deal with space inside the Department of Defense. And so a lot of press. The Air Force had been taking a beating for a long time and would continue to. But 2 days later, the Air Force, we did our big rollout. And Congressman Rogers' response was to the A11, right, which was going to be the answer. His response was, "Oh, great, box number 61." And you can imagine, how well that went over. But still, the Air Force was committed to it, and we went through that process. So, through 2017, we developed the plan, and we got it approved. And I was, in fact, a 2-star at the time, Vice Commander of Air Force Space Command, nominated to become the Air Force A11. And on November 1st of 2017, I was confirmed by Congress to be Lieutenant General, 3-star, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Air Force for Space Operations. And on November 8th, 8 days later, the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act was signed, which said very clearly the Air Force cannot, will not, and shall not establish and shall not spend any money on Deputy Chief of Staff for space operations. So, after having been confirmed, I was fired by act of Congress, and the A11 disappeared. So after that, with agreement with Congress, we established an office in the Pentagon that was actually officially assigned Air Force Space Command, and I became the vice commander of Air Force Space Command as a 3-star, working space-related activities in the Pentagon, but officially assigned back to Air Force Space Command and work for General Raymond in Colorado.
That's a unique accomplishment.
Yeah,
right?
there may have been others, but I challenge you to find anybody else who was officially fired by act of Congress.
Yes, sir.
8 days after they confirmed me.
So, sir, you helped establish the Space Force planning team, and I've already alluded to Task Force Tango that Jack Fisher led. Can you discuss the Space Force planning team and what it accomplished?
Yeah. So by so obviously 2017 had passed, and Secretary Wilson at the time had this sense of where things were going. It wasn't until June of 2018. President Trump, in his first term, pointed to the chairman, General Dumford, and said, "Build me a plan for a Space Force." But in February and March of that year, Secretary Wilson saw the handwriting on the wall and said, "We need to get ahead of this. We need to start building a plan because it's pretty clear we're probably going to be told to do this." And so the vice chief at the time, Sevy Wilson, came to me and he said, "DT, we need to put together a planning team, and who should be in charge of it?" And for me, the answer was easy. Major General Clint Crozier, who we really wanted to be here today. It's a shame that he couldn't have been, but he had schedule conflicts. Had just finished. He was assigned to the Air Staff. He had just finished a planning team to build this thing for General Goldfein called the Air Force Warfighting Integration Center, which General Goldfein's vision had been there are too many stovepipes. We think about systems and platforms and capabilities at the tactical level in stovepipes. We need to start working hard at how do these things fit together? How do we write requirements that aren't just for one platform? How do we truly integrate Air Force capabilities, air and space capabilities, more effectively? And Clint had just led the team to plan and implement that. He had just finished that work. He was a career space officer. I had both worked for him and with him many times, and those of you who know him know how tenacious he is, how aggressive he is, how detail-oriented he was. And it took me about 3 seconds to say Clint Crozier. And he had worked for Sevy Wilson in the past, and he said, "Yep, you're exactly right." And so, within a matter of minutes, Clint was assigned to build and then execute the Air Force Planning Task Force that built the plan for the Space Force.
So, sir, obviously there was some institutional resistance, both White House and congressional. There was White House advocacy, congressional advocacy, but there were obviously some institutional resistance. Can you give some insight into those opposing views?
Yeah, and let me say there was institutional resistance, but there also was not. And I would say two people who never get enough credit for what they did are Secretary Heather Wilson and General Goldfein, both of whom, and especially if you looked at Secretary Wilson's congressional testimony that she gave as she was being nominated and ultimately confirmed to be the Air Force Secretary, and you looked at what General Goldfein did, both absolutely believed the way that we were organized, supported, and conducted space activities and operations inside the United States Air Force had to change. We were being shortchanged, and we had to fix this problem. They absolutely believed that and were working hard to do that through this process. They both also believed firmly, however, that the space missions and space organizations needed to remain part of the United States Air Force and not for I never heard parochial reasons, but they thought as a matter of effectiveness, the best way to do this was to increase the footprint, the visibility, to some extent the advocacy and the individual nature, but not they both believed that trying to create it as a separate service was not the right approach until and they advocated and they and made all their arguments until President Trump said, "Build me a plan for the Space Force," at which point they did what leaders are supposed to do. They saluted sharply and fully dedicated themselves to execute the mission and the direction given to them by the President of the United States. Now, ever since then and ever after that, they were still, others continued to point at them and say that they weren't really, that they were not doing what they were supposed to do, which wasn't correct. The day he made that decision But when the president said, go do this, they were fully committed to it and fully supportive of it. It was just they had spent so much time publicly, as you would expect beforehand, talking about what they believed the best way to handle this problem was, that they got painted with that brush and were never, in my opinion, really given the credit they deserve for ensuring that once the decision was made, the Department of the Air Force was 100% fully behind what we needed to do to create the Space Force.
And so really what seemed to be one of the key turning points in the discussion was when General Crozier focused on the kind of core functions that you needed to be a service. You didn't need all, there's so many functions we could rely on the Air Force for. It was focusing on operations, acquisitions, intel, communications, training our own people in acquiring our own systems. Once he kind of focused on that, that seemed to be the tipping point for a lot of, am I correct in that?
Well, yeah, what happened before that, he was given that construct as the plan to execute. Because what had happened before that, in the fall of 2018, inside of the Department of Defense, Steve Kittay was the leader of this planning team, or this larger strategic planning team. And Steve led it, and myself and some others were part of it. We actually looked at 5 different organizational approaches to the Space Force. The first was make it a professional corps like the medical corps. The second was create Combatant Command, U.S. Space Command, which was ultimately created, but give it extra service-like authorities, much like Special Operations Command has today, extra acquisition authorities, some things like that. The third was what we had already kind of developed inside of the Department of the Air Force was keep it a part of the United States Air Force, but give it even more independence in that regard, but make it remain as part of the U.S. Air Force. The fourth was a separate service inside the Department of the Air Force, like the Marine Corps was in the Department of the Navy. And the fourth was totally separate Department of the U.S. Space Force, different service secretary, so on and so forth. And that group decided the best answer was the Corps model, right, which was a second service inside of the Department of the Air Force. But then Clint and his team did go very clearly through, okay, what should the Space Force do, and what should we continue to rely on the United States Air Force for? And he absolutely came up with those. And part of the reason was the Space Force was so small, it could not sustain those other functions, right? So civil engineers, security forces, medical corps, lawyers, all of those that the Air Force had in great abundance and had been doing space-related activities for years, they could do all those to operate bases, to support us with medical support and other things. If we had tried to break that off and make those uniform members of the Space Force, far too much administrative overhead, and those career fields would have still been too small to be self-sustaining. And so that's how we came up with that model, and he did the work. He did the work, and his team to lay it out and help make those decisions.
So, sir, December 19th happened. National Defense Authorization Act is signed in the hangar at Andrews. Initially, the plan was 2 years to stand up a service. And then January, General Raymond, who was, I guess, one story we'll get, General Endicott will actually be able to tell the story. We didn't know who the CSO was going to be until I think they were bringing the NDAA over to the hangar. So he's designated as the first CSO. He's invited to participate in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we thought we had 2 years. Instead, we had maybe 2 days.
Yeah.
How did you handle standing up a service and running a service all at the same time?
Yeah, you're right. And when you have Krusty Endicott, he has to tell you the story about running around the White House trying to find the paperwork to the point, point, because the law allowed that for General Raymond without the normal confirmation process to find that paperwork so it could be signed, so that we actually had a CSO when the president signed the law. But Clint Crozier's plan, a very unbelievably well-developed plan basically said, okay, from the day the law is signed, we need 1 year to plan and prepare for the stand-up of military service. And so the plan was, okay, the law is signed. Here's all the activities that we need to do. We need to stand up a service staff. We need to get the organization right. We need to nominate and confirm a CSO and all these other people, laid it all out in tremendous detail. And the plan said on the first anniversary of the signature of the law saying it was okay to establish the U.S. Space Force, we would then stand up the U.S. Space Force. Well, the law said no. When the law is signed, there is a U.S. Space Force, right? So just to prove the point that plans are nothing, planning is everything. We basically stood up the Space Force right away, and the law also said you have 18 months to get the whole job done, right? So it's as soon as it's signed, it's there, and you have 18 months to finish the job, whatever that meant. The good news is it just said you have 18 months. We got to decide we got to define what we had to have done by the end of 18 months. But yeah, it was, and J.R. Reardon, hopefully someday. J.R. Reardon is a retired Air Force colonel, career space officer, who General Raymond and I convinced to come out of, he had got retired, had gone into private industry, was, doing wonderfully in the commercial space company. And we convinced him to go be a staffer on the Senate Armed Services Committee because we really needed somebody to write the law for us. And, being the great American he was and great airman he was, he saluted sharply and said, "Yes, sir." And he has some stories that need to be captured about how all that happened. But they did that work to say it's two things. One is you're a service on day one, and the second thing is you're authorized to appoint, and it wasn't, I think the words were the commander of Air Force Space Command as the first chief of space operations. And so really General Raymond was the only person who could have been appointed on day one. Otherwise, we would have had to have gone through the normal nomination confirmation process. And so we became a service on day one. General Raymond became the chief of space operations and the first and only member of the force on day one. And then we rapidly went about we took Clint's plan. The plan was still a good plan. We just executed it while we were, going to meetings in the Pentagon. And, yeah, the good news was everybody put us on their meeting invitation lists on day one. The bad news is they also put us on all their task lists on day one. But yeah, it was, at the time I wanted to choke J.R. Reardon because I thought, you have done the worst possible thing to us. In hindsight, it was brilliant. It was brilliant.
I think on the initial org charts, you were the vice chief of space operations plus S1 through.
Not exactly. Not exactly. I was the vice chief. That was Nina Armagno, General Nina Armagno. We did some things very quickly, including and let me also say this. You talked about institutional resistance. Especially, I know many of you are former retired airmen. I could not have been more proud of the United States Air Force in this entire process, especially once the law was signed. No institutional resistance. The work that both the air staff and the secretary staff to help us from the day this began was just fabulous. Nothing to gain. You told the story of how bad it was between the Army and the Air Force and the Air Corps. Leading up to and after that split, General Goldfein, to this day talks about how messy a divorce that was and how there's scar tissue that remains today. There was none of that between the Space Force and the Air Force. They immediately gave us an S1 named Pat Mulcahy, who was a senior executive, had been a Army personnelist, was just fabulous. I was the vice chief, the vice commander of the U.S. Space Force. General Saltzman, the current CSO, Salty was the director of staff, and Nina Armagno was everything else.
Yep.
We called her the S-43 because she was the S2, the S3, the S4, the S5, the S6, the S7, the S8, and S9. Or, you add all those numbers up, and you get the 43. I was the vice, Salty was the director of staff, Pat was the S1, and Nina Armagno was everything else. And to this day, she has not let us forget about that.
So I'll tell you a funny story about the support for the Air Force. So as the general said, we invited all the meetings, and at a certain point you run out of generals and you defer to who you have on hand, which was about 8 colonels. I was one of them.
Yep.
When you are the principal at a tank session, because they will have a tank whether the DCS ops happens, whether you want one or not, every week. The admirals love it when a colonel is sitting at the table and they're not, because they're sitting behind you because they're not the principal and you are. General Russ Mack will never forget this, but I got sent to one of these meetings. I'm like, oh, this is going to be bad. And he's like, hey, Stu, come here. It's great. And he puts his arm around me and sets me down and guided me through the whole process. And it was, could have been a lot worse than it was, but that was very indicative of kind of the Air Force support.
Well, and like I said, I mean, the plan that Clint Crozier created, and his team, not just Clint, he had a team working with him. We would have just floundered. We would have drowned without that. First of all, the second thing is, said they gave us. Congress said you'll be done in 18 months, and like at the third meeting we had, by that time Secretary Wilson had moved on. It was Secretary Barbara Barrett. At like the third meeting we had with her, she looked at us and said, "Oh, Congress wants it done in 18 months. You'll have it done in 15 months." And it's like, okay, if 18 months is not doable, I'm sure, so what? 18 months we're not going to be done, so 15 months, who cares? Whatever. But again, we got to decide what the definition of done was. And for us, the definition of done was the organizational structure was in place and it was resourced, right? It was resourced, not meaning all the resources were there, but we had laid in the plan over 5 years to get all the people and all the organizations. We had all the stand-up plans and how it's going to lay out, and all of that had been laid into the program over 5 years, and at which point we said, yep, we're done, thank you, and nobody asked any more questions, and so we just moved on. But as tragic, another thing that helped us, I hate to say it this way, another thing that helped us tremendously was COVID. As tragic as it was for the nation and the world, and, millions of Americans died and tens of millions at least around the world, March of 2020, everybody went home. I had never seen the Pentagon a ghost town. But everybody went home except for people in the Department of Defense working COVID response and the Space Force headquarters staff. We all stayed there. And we never exceeded our authority, but there was nobody there to ask for questions, ask for meetings, throw sand in the gears, say, wait a minute, why do you think you're allowed to make that decision? So we just got to do all the work we needed to do, made the decisions we knew we had the authority to make, and nobody else was there to stop us. So in that sense, it helped in the establishment of the Space Force because we just started moving out and getting stuff done without the standard mire and slowdown that comes with the Pentagon bureaucracy.
So I remember some of the early challenges. There was an office space. We didn't even know what we were going to call guardians.
Yep.
That was up for debate. We didn't know what we were going to call the units. But I know early on we had some successes in that first year. What would you kind of consider the early initial successes in the stand-up of the Space Force?
Yeah, well, I say the first is, it really is. I mean, I hate to say that, but COVID let us quickly make decisions on organization and decide what those were going to be without a whole bunch of other people deciding they wanted to be part of that discussion. The second was we did get those decisions made, like what's our organizational structure going to be? And this isn't a shot at the Air Force because you could argue this is exactly how the Air Force should be organized. We pulled 2 layers of executive leadership out of our command chain, right? The Air Force went from squadrons to wings to numbered air forces. Do I have that right? Squadrons to wings to groups,
Yep.
to numbered air forces, to major commands. And in our organization, we pulled out groups. We went from squadrons to what we call deltas, which is '06 command equivalent. And we pulled out numbered air forces and went straight to field commands, which is sort of the equivalent of major commands. And again, it's not that that's the wrong structure for the Air Force, but it was the wrong structure for us. And so we removed a couple of those layers and built an organizational structure that was right for us. As much as people do make fun of it, things like core values and songs and uniforms and those sorts of things that help to build the culture of who and what you are and want to be, we got all of those done as well, and I think they turned out all right. Those sorts of things. And then really finally the plan itself, which said here's the organizational structure and the fact that all the resources have been laid in. And we knew how they were going to fall in, and you know, people who were working way too long and way too hard, they knew that, you know, hey, next year, you know, hang in there because next year your manpower is going to get doubled, right? And, you know, the year after that. So a lot of those, the ability to really lay in the plan and say, here it is, and let's go, were some of our best successes. And, well, and let me say one thing. The other thing is, all of those missions we conducted, most of them had come from the Air Force, a few from the Army and Navy. In that turbulent period of stand-up, never put a foot wrong in terms of mission operations, right? There's always something goes wrong, something here, something goes wrong there. That's just the fact of operations. But nobody ever really dropped the ball on space operations because they were focused on what we had to do to create the Space Force.
And so, sir, you already mentioned J.R. Reardon, and that I took that as an action item. I will.
Yep.
We will get him on record because, yeah, I remember him being the key guy across the river.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of some other unsung heroes out there. There's Kathy Lovelady. When we talk about the uniforms, I think she's still working uniforms for the Space Force.
Yeah.
No one will ever know her name, but she will impact every Guardian from here on out. Are there any other folks that we should be reaching out to and talking to?
Well, I did. Yeah, we mentioned a couple. You know, the big four after the national leadership, the president, the chairman, the members of Congress. The big four that made the Space Force happen: Steve Kattay, both in Congress and in the Department of Defense; Clint Crozier, who did the planning; J.R. Reardon, who wrote the law; and the fourth is Matt O'Kane. Matt O'Kane was a GS-15 over an OMB, who did a lot of the behind-the-scenes ensuring that nothing happened. But then you've got Pat Mulcahy, who was the S1. You got Nina Armagno. You got those people. But then I would go down, and you probably know that list better than I do. Not just Kathy Lovelady, but guys like Rob Rigo. Rob was, I don't remember if he had retired at the time. He was basically working as an independent contractor somehow, or something. But he was a reserve officer. He ultimately retired as a Reserve 2-star, but he was just a civilian guy. I think he was officially what do you call those guys?
IMA?
Not an IMA. The Special Government Employee for Strategic Command. That's right. And I remember Strategic Command. I remember talking to Chaz Richards and talking him into just giving them to us, And Rob was one of those guys that just got stuff done. But you, and I know you're not fishing for a compliment here, but you and a whole bunch of chiefs and colonels, especially those, first of all, some of them came over from the Air Force, one being a guy named Colonel Sean Campbell, who was a personnelist, right? Never was a space person, never was going to be a space person, but he just came and he was our deputy S1, right? And a bunch of people, you and many others like you, there were colonels who had been their whole lives, space colonels in the Air Force.
Morgan.
D. Morgan, Che Bradley, a bunch of those guys who were so fired up that this was going to happen, who were colonels who knew they were never going to officially get to be called Guardians, part of the Space Force, but even they were Air Force through and through, but they were also space people through and through. And there were probably several dozen, Two Fish is one of them sitting over there, who were colonels who knew that they were never going to get to be officially part of the United States Space Force, but this was a labor of love for them because it was what they had, in essence, in some way, shape, or form, trying to work towards their whole life. And so that list probably better than I do of all of those colonels and some of the chiefs and senior master sergeants and master sergeants who knew the last thing they had to do before they retired was build this thing, even though they knew as they were doing it, they were never officially going to get to be part of it.
Chief Simmons, Chief Benevania, who we're lucky to have as a SimSIF.
Yeah. So those are all the people, and that list better than I do. After you talk to all the flag officers, whatever.
Well, thank you so much, sir. This is, like I said, I've been waiting for this. This is a highlight for me on the of this event because you were in the room where it happened. That was amazing. Dick, I think we might have some time for a couple questions.
Absolutely. Before you ask a question, we got a hot mic. So we'll get the mic up
You
to you.
okay with questions? All right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One right here up front, Patsy's got a question.
Sir, a question about whether it was going to be a Space Corps or Space Force. The narrative I heard was General Mattis says there's only one Corps. So what was I know there was a debate at one time about it.
So this is my read. I mean, go back and look at the tapes and et cetera, right? President Trump in June of 2018 looked at the chairman and said, "Build me a plan for a space force." It was going to be a space force. Congressman Rogers and Congressman Cooper had been advocating for a Space Corps, and frankly, what they got was a Space Corps that was just happened to be named the Space Force, right? I'd never heard anything about the Marine Corps now, but I also know, and I was going to say I'll tell you in confidence, but just like Dave Deptula, apparently this is on tape. Let's just say after that I had several conversations with Congressman Cooper, who seemed to be unhappy that the Space Force wasn't what it should be. And my answer to him was, "Sir, it's exactly what you asked for, except for the name." And let's just say I didn't endear myself to him with that answer. But, yeah.
So one of the curiosity things is he said you were working towards this, and then President Trump said, "Build me one." Where did the idea for President Trump come from to say, "Build me one"?
So Congressman Rogers, Mike Rogers from Alabama, always takes credit for it, and I think he may well be right. I wasn't in the room, obviously, and most of us weren't, but he's the one who believes he convinced President Trump to do that, and that seems like it's pretty reasonable. The National Space Council. One of the things President Trump had done before that was recreate or re-energize the National Space Council. The executive director was Dr. Scott Pace, for that first one, and he insists, and you can ask Krusty, get firsthand accounts from Krusty. He insists they all reviewed the transcripts and the prepared remarks for that National Space Council meeting, and there was nothing in the prepared remarks about a U.S. Space Force. So they all, to this day, say, at least secondhand from me, they had not prepared him to say that. They didn't expect him to say that. They went back after the fact and looked again just to make sure it wasn't in the teleprompter. But apparently, the president decided on his own he was going to do it this time, and Congressman Rogers takes credit for it, and I think it's a reasonable claim.
Thank you.
Yep.
Back here, General. As growing up as an airman, I learned a whole lot about the airman culture and all that kind of stuff, but I've been a very joint person throughout my career. One of the things I do is I try to live and learn what the Army and the Navy guys are, especially their vernacular. There's certain ways they talk about things. I have a question for you on the Space Force. It may sound silly, but I want to understand. When we talk about Army, we talk about them being on the ground, boots on the ground. Navy is at sea. Air Force is in the air, in flight. Yet instead of being in orbit, the Space Force always seems to say on orbit. Is there a distinction for that, or is that just a quirk?
No, I don't know of one. I think it's just a different way of, yeah. I would say it's a quirk. There's no doctrinal or other thing. I've never heard anybody correct somebody for saying one or the other. In orbit, on orbit, to me is the same thing.
General, this afternoon there is a scheduled press conference, and they're going to announce the funding for the Golden Dome. Initial $25 billion, going to $500 billion. The three people that are there are going to be our president. It's going to be the defense secretary, and it's going to be the Space Force vice chief. I'm thinking about that, and I'm saying, do you think that this is going to be run by Space Force, the Golden Dome?
Yeah, so my understanding is it will be run out of the Secretary of Defense's office, and that Space Force vice will no longer be the vice, I believe. He will be solely assigned to this duty and will either work directly for the Secretary of Defense or the Deputy Secretary of Defense. That's my understanding. Please take that, as my understanding today, which may or may not be 100% accurate. So in that sense, the anticipation is it will not be run by the Space Force initially. What I would say is most of Golden Dome is going to be space-based and is likely to be operated by the Space Force. And the reason the Space Force vice was selected, he is perhaps the singular person in the United States of America who's prepared to execute that for a couple of reasons. First of all, he's an engineer and an acquisition officer and a program manager, so he knows how to get things done programmatically to get them into the field. The second thing is he was the deputy director of the Missile Defense Agency as a 2-star. He was the deputy director of the National Reconnaissance Office as a 2-star. Then he was commander of Space Systems Command as a 3-star in the Space Force, and now the vice chief. And the key organizations who are going to have to put Golden Dome together are the United States Space Force, the National Reconnaissance Office, and the Missile Defense Agency. So, now, my opinion, should the Space Force be running most of those systems, operating them once they're in orbit? Yes, we'll see how that sorts out. But that's why he was selected, not specifically because he was a Space Force officer, but because he had the right set of skills and experiences. If anybody can pull it off, he will. So.
So space encompasses a lot of areas, and of course the Canadians evidently have already said they're going to sign up for the Golden Dome support, and they've been working NORAD for many years. Did your planning, when you started looking, did you look beyond just the U.S.? Air Marshal Godfrey is in a key position in Space Force. He's there as a Space Force person, not just as an RAF liaison. Was that part of the planning, was to take a look beyond just, because space, of course, covers the entire globe, beyond just our own services, to be incorporating our close allies as well? So in our work, we hadn't done detailed planning in that regard for two reasons. The first was that was always going to be part of the detailed planning that we were going to do in that first year before we stood up. And so
So we knew it was on the to-do list for things in that first year, but when they said, no, you're on day one, go, we just started, it was all hands on deck, call out the fire brigade, do whatever. So we didn't have a detailed plan other than an item on the checklist that said, figure out how we're going to incorporate and deal with international partners. So in that sense, we knew we had to do it, we hadn't gotten to it. The second is there's actually a pretty extensive set of international activities around space already that had been started about 10 years earlier through U.S. Strategic Command, who owned the space missions at the time, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy in space, working with international partners. And in fact, Strategic Command at the time, General Raymond was there, I was there, we were working for Bob Kaler, and Bob Kaler was the guy who said, JDT, you guys go start this thing. And so what happened was it had been going for a decade, and once the Space Force was stood up, the role that Strategic Command and the United States Air Force played in that set of activities immediately became the responsibility of the Space Force. And so those were the initial things, but as you've seen, like you said with Goddard's and others, we have grown it from here, but it wasn't a tremendous focus immediately for those reasons. And we still have a long way to go in that regard.
Dick, give us a hook when you need us. We could probably go for a while.
Follow-up question. You spoke about how you envision Golden Dome going to work directly for the SecDef or the DepSecDef. With or NORAD, where's NORAD fitting in a command relationship? Is there a vertical divide between areas of operation? Are they co-equal because you have the Canadians on both parts?
Yeah,
of that? How's that work?
That's going to have to be work to be done, and very specifically, this is a change of state for Canada, because for decades now, Canada has been deeply involved in NORAD and the warning missions for air and missile attack against North America. They have specifically divorced themselves from defensive aspects of missile attack primarily. All that work that MDA did, the sensor suites, the interceptors in Alaska and Vandenberg, in other words, the Canadians made a decision decades ago, or at least a decade ago, to say we don't want to be any part of that. We want the warning mission. We want to be part of the air defense mission. We don't want any part of missile defense. And so what exactly that's going to look like in relationship to NORAD, NORTHCOM, all of those sorts of command relationships will have to be sorted out, especially now that Canada appears to have said it's changed its mind. None of that structure's in place. The missile defense, the warning activities against North America for missile attack and air defense attack run through NORAD. The defense runs through NORTHCOM. And so those respond. So now the good news is there's the commander of NORAD, NORTHCOM, but so if it deals with warning, it runs through the NORAD chain, and if the commander, the 4-star commander, is not there, it runs through the Canadian 3-star. If we're going to respond in defense, the Weapons Release Authority runs through NORTHCOM, and so if the NORAD NORTHCOM commander's not there, the NORTHCOM American 3-star gives weapons release authority for the interceptors to strike an incoming missile. So it is a mess, but that's one of the reasons it's a mess is because of Canada's decision a long time ago. Hopefully, if in fact they're going to be part of it, that's part of the cleanup that can be done and will be done, but it's going to be a while till they sort that out. Right now, Golden Dome is mostly about developing the architecture and really getting hard after developing and fielding capabilities. It's going to be a little while before there's enough operational capability in place that you really have to understand the command and control relationships. But they'll start working on it now.
Yeah, awesome, sir. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I can't thank you enough for coming here and taking time out of your schedule, because I think it's so important to capture these stories for future historians and the historians in this room. So
Very good. Yep.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for your time and what you do.
Well, these are like amazing groups of folks who are just amazing. This is fantastic. Thanks, General Thompson. That was great. Good job, Stu. And for all you do for the foundation too, buddy. Awesome job. We're going to take a little break to do what you need to do, but then we're going to shift gears a little bit. David Arnold and Emily Margolis are going to come up. They're going to talk about objects, artifacts related to the birth of the Space Force. And some of them are sitting right out here on the floor, which is really kind of cool. So take a breather and we'll reset and get ready to go. We got a little bit to go. Stick with us. We're actually a little bit ahead. So let's, I don't know, promote me.